some people that believe Bible prophecy doesn't exist today.
Folks, we live in a world today where we're all being bombarded by the media. Products, services, and even news are made out to be bigger and more important than they actually are. And so how do we as individuals know how to decide what's important for us in our lives? A few minutes ago you saw this ferocious dragon on the camera. And he was made out to be much bigger and more ferocious than he actually is, as you can see. But it makes my point. Through manipulation and camera tricks, you can make a problem or a situation or even a dragon or a beast much bigger than it actually is in order to influence people in the way that you want them to go. Even with the Bible, folks, you can take Bible prophecies out of context. You can spin the Bible. You can make it appear that you're fulfilling prophecies by your own will.
How do we tell if a real Bible prophecy has occurred?
Iraqi veterans are buying my book, and my greatest satisfaction is to know that I have brought them a real Bible prophecy about Iraq. Ancient Babylon has a biblical connection to the freeing of Iraq today by great eagle wings in the last days. It thrills me to bring something so powerful that silences the critics.
Are you ready to see a real Bible prophecy fulfilled, rather than another speculation?
King Nebuchadnezzar was the great king of Babylon, who walked the earth without a human heart, a monster who took pleasure by inflicting pain as he conquered the earth.
The great Gentile king had a dream where he saw himself planting a tree which grew above the whole earth. The basis of the entire Bible is found on two trees representing good from evil. The devil sought his power by unifying humans to his tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. The devil was removed from his tree and given a lowly ground curse, lower than any beast or human. Babel was the devil's new plan to unite the branches of the human family to a man-made tree, becoming a tyranny or a oneness of evil. The fall of the tower becomes another fallen tree and another failure for Satan to gather mankind and exalt evil to heavenly heights.
There is a very important connection between Babel and Babylon. Notice that even the word Babylon is derived from Babel. Few Christians notice that Babylon is Satan's second attempt to exalt another Babel by political means.
I never had any idea what the two trees in the garden really meant.
No one has ever exactly told me what those trees mean, till now.
I've been a Christian my whole life, and this is the first time I've made a connection with the two trees in the garden and two cities, Babylon and Jerusalem.
Nebuchadnezzar built his tree by gathering the human branches of Gentile kingdoms he conquered. Why? To unite the human branches of mankind into one Zion type. Daniel uses clues from the Garden of Eden, paralleling the famous gardens of Babylon. The king's authority is identified as being above the fowls of heaven exactly, like Adam in the garden.
And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven he hath given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all.
After mankind had fallen, God exalts a bush, not a tree. Daniel was sent to Babylon to teach this king about Israel's God, who dwelt in a burning bush. The king needed to learn that a true paradise could not be achieved in a fallen world, especially by using man's political system to achieve it. The established biblical symbolism depicting God's power of deliverance is spelled out clearly as both a burning bush and also eagle's wings. Moses was gathering all the branches of Israel into one designated place. The voice which commanded this event came directly from a burning bush. The king's tower, made of gold, became a type of second tower of Babel, once again trying to gather the Gentile and Hebrew branches to a golden tree of spiritual life. Like Moses, the king gathers the tribes into one designated place to worship Babylon's god. He uses political force to make them fall down and worship the image. He seeks a type of oneness or a Zion type in Babylon.
And whoso falleth not down and worshippeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace.
But the three Hebrews were willing to die for religious freedoms. They refused the king's order and were sentenced to death in the king's fiery furnace.
When the three Hebrews were cast into the fire, this fire had no power to consume their bodies. A fourth man, like unto the Son of God, appears in the fire suddenly.
And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace.
Hebrew branches appear to burn in the fire, but are not harmed nor consumed. Christ, the root and branch, gathers a burning bush for Gentiles gathered at one designated place in Babylon. He is seen by all those Gentiles gathered that day. It was he who represented the same God in the burning bush, who transforms man's fire into God's fire. So the king's plan to establish a political Zion backfires. Instead, all of these Gentile branches are gathered to he who dwelt in the burning bush. They witness the fire which burns but does not consume. Thus the Lord sent Daniel and these Hebrews to Babylon to lay the foundation for gathering Gentiles to Israel's God in the bush in the latter days.
I remember God was in the burning bush, but I never realized that Shadrach and the other two were in the same fire with God later.
An extremely strange occurrence was recorded in the Bible concerning these three Hebrews before being cast into the fire. All of their clothing was bound in a kind of luggage or suitcase, and this bound clothing was cast into the fire with the three men.
What in the world was the king's rationale for throwing these three into the fire, bound with their luggage and all their clothing?
Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
The king was given to an evil nature as if he were half human. The evil side of the king was like a cruel lion in nature. Daniel describes the king as like a lion with eagle wings, as if he had two natures conflicting within his heart. The wings also represented his political power swiftly, conquering the nations and forcing them to unite to his Babylon.
Daniel is definitely giving the world clues which connect both Adam and Moses to Daniel's time. We read about God's means of deliverance for Israel in the wilderness, and later Gentiles are also delivered on eagle's wings.
Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and how I brought you unto myself.
Now, folks, none of these prophecies in the book of Daniel are going to make a lick of sense to you until we properly link them up to the last days.
Daniel the prophet was sending us direct clues that would demonstrate perfect types and shadows for our day. He was speaking to us through prophetic events that he recorded in Babylon. Christians must understand that Daniel states this clearly within his own writings.
But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter, and he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee.
Daniel states the only reason he came to Babylon was to reveal a message for our day.
Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days.
This biblical instruction was so profound that God told Daniel to seal the book until the last days. The book would make no sense until something significant happened in our day.
O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even till the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased.
So every clue that starts in Daniel's time must now be projected forward to our time.
By God's decree and command, the king was rendered insane for 7 years, where he lost his humanity completely, becoming like a wild beast for 7 years, crawling on all fours like a maniac. Going through withdrawals from his addiction to power, being weaned off his cruel lion nature gradually. The withdrawals from his addiction made him go mad, until the lion within his heart finally tamed. But when the king got too prideful and high on himself, God plucked his wings and the king was removed from his throne. The king was addicted to his notoriety in Babylon. It was a tree of pride that God was removing with a painful surgery. The spirit of Babylon takes root in the man's heart.
Every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. And a holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, Hew down the tree and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves and scatter his fruit.
In the king's dream, all that was left was the stump from the evil tree. God commands that it be left as a memorial to the king's evil pride. The king planted an evil tree of misery. The roots of that tree would live on after him.
Could that memorial stump signify the foundations of Babylon surviving in Iraq today? Iraq is rooted directly to Babylon. The king was addicted to Babylon like an addiction to evil fruit in the Garden of Eden. The king's evil heart was cast into the stump, separating him from his addiction and freeing him from his dependency on notoriety and high pride. Though this was a dream and highly symbolic, it was a dream from the Lord. The king saw a wet mist come up from the earth and baptize him. He then dreamt that he grew eagle feathers coming out from the old roots of his political wings God had plucked off. The eagle wings signify a spiritual transformation from captivity to true freedom.
The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws.
And the king praised God for setting him free, and he became a new king with a new heart. Since Daniel established Nebuchadnezzar as the great head of the Gentile family tree, were the Gentiles in the last days going to change into free eagles also? Wasn't the king a puppet for latter-day prophecy being fulfilled today? What about the stump? Why did God command it to be watered and preserved in the earth? Why dedicate the ground and its roots for no future purpose? Is a stump not a preservation of life lasting far into the Gentiles' future? A time capsule for future fruition in the latter days? What does a watered stump become eventually?
Is it there?
Daniel the prophet records a powerful clue given to him by God. A preserved watered stump is a prophecy fulfilled when Iraq is later transformed into a bush of freedom in the latter days. Since Nebuchadnezzar grew eagle's wings, is Iraq to be transformed into a free eagle after being delivered by the symbol of a bush, paralleling the Israelites' path to freedom? The single and most important clue regarding the stump was God's command to bind the stump with iron and brass rings.
Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven.
Binding the stump would prohibit the stump from becoming a freed bush until far into the future. In other words, postponing freedom for Iraq until the last days, when a modern bush would be allowed to transform the stump after freeing it from captive roots and allowing the heart of an eagle to replace the evil lion's nature, perfectly matching the same transformation Nebuchadnezzar experienced, being changed from a lion nature to a free eagle. This is a perfect type and shadow prophecy for today. Daniel makes it clear that the king is only a puppet for the Gentiles in the last days. The Gentiles later escaped captivity by fleeing to America, which became their new eagle wings, or a symbol of freedom from a king. So, in the last days, America gained its freedom of worship by standing up to King George and a European religious Babylon. Just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood up to King Nebuchadnezzar for their religious freedom, so, in the last days, America gained its freedom of worship by standing up to King George and a European religious Babylon. Amazing beyond words is the fact that England borrowed the symbol of the lion from Babylon. So in the last days, you literally have Gentiles changing from a lion to an eagle through great suffering, paralleling Nebuchadnezzar's painful withdrawal and transformation, changing from a lion to an eagle nature when they established the United States of America. The two trees in the garden represent free people who seek God's Zion and captive people who are enslaved by the spirit of Babylon. Tower of Babel and King Nebuchadnezzar's golden image represent Satan's tree, where man seeks to reach heaven and paradise by building a man-made political system using earthly wealth and power. The trees are hollow and lifeless, producing the fruit which brings spiritual death. God cuts both of these trees down to scatter the human branches away from unification of death for a counterfeit tree of life. Daniel the prophet makes it very clear in chapter 8 that towers and high horns represent the political leader who is elevated to the height of a deity, and people worship the government, which is the domain of the leader who represents the highest horn. This very same pattern was common in our day, as dictators often are venerated by palaces with horns that reach to heaven. Worshipping a government becomes another Tower of Babel, or a tree producing evil fruit. There are two sides to Babylon. Spiritual Babylon is a corruption of men's hearts through false worship. A physical Babylon is the actual corrupt government or evil tree itself. King Nebuchadnezzar dealt with spiritual Babylon within his own heart. His son Belshazzar, however, refused to repent, and Babylon itself was destroyed, along with Belshazzar the king being executed. The great head and horn was wounded to death. Babylon was to become like a stump in the earth, being preserved alive, but unfruitfully bound until 7 kingdoms within 4 world empires passed over it. There must be a parallel match in the last days, where the lion, Nebuchadnezzar, and the young lion, Nebuchadnezzar's son, are restored in a parallel type of prophecy when the head wound is healed. It becomes world news when Saddam Hussein rebuilds the city of Babylon right on top of the ancient foundations of old Babylon. He even rebuilds Nebuchadnezzar's palace, spending billions of dollars. Adjacent to Nebuchadnezzar's palace, Saddam builds a second palace to himself, glorifying his name as the man who restored Babylon in our day. He is declared in the media to be Nebuchadnezzar II, as if he were the son of Nebuchadnezzar brought back to life in our day. The young lion wounded to death was restored again. Saddam Hussein sought to invade Kuwait in order to gain the world's oil supply and bring the world to its knees under a new Babylon. But a bush and an eagle came to stop him, again with a parallel type today.
This is definitely a clue about a bush transforming Iraq. I'm just a little irritated that other ministers haven't failed to make this known.
It was amazing how Saddam Hussein actually resembled a lion. Members of his family say that his nature was like a lion, making people afraid as he passed. Daniel the prophet in chapter 4 has confused the Christian world for hundreds of years when he tells King Nebuchadnezzar that his tree would not be completely destroyed, but the enemy of Babylon would have their tree destroyed. Since this never happened in Nebuchadnezzar's time, Daniel must be referring to the last days when the eagle's tree, the enemy of Babylon, is hewn down. The prophet declared, "Let the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies."
The Trade Center was an economic tree with branches and boughs, exactly as Daniel described it 2,500 years ago.
Nebuchadnezzar the king only dreamed that he grew eagle's wings, which represented his change of heart when he found God's deliverance. Only today can we look at the Gentiles in America and witness how literal the prophetic dream was fulfilled in our day. The Gentiles did grow eagle's wings and were given literal power over the fowls of heaven, flying above the eagles, even going to the moon, reaching the heavens, as Daniel prophesied. All these prophecies were sealed in Daniel's time and then unsealed today at the time of the end, when knowledge to do these things was increased.
Hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump and the roots thereof in the earth.
Just as 3 freedom-loving innocent men were cast into the fiery furnace, made several times hotter in Babylon, so were 3 American airlines filled with freedom-loving innocent people, cast into a modern fiery furnace, made several times hotter because of the exploding jet fuel. So we have another perfect match with 3 American eagles, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being forced into fiery furnaces.
When you look at this with an honest analysis, you will find that the author is perfectly following biblical context and not inventing his own ideas. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were all thrown into a furnace with their clothes. This is an obvious twin prophecy to the 3 planes which, full of people bound with their luggage, crashed into the World Trade Centers and Pentagon on September 11th.
Just as King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of a symbolic stump representing fallen Babylon, bound with brass and iron,
So, a huge stump made of iron and brass was all that was left of this fallen tree, witnessed by the whole world at ground zero. This stump becomes a sacred memorial where the roots are watered by the people's tears. Another perfect match with Daniel's ancient prophecy, which was to befall Babylon's enemy. A modern economic tree was hewn down to a memorial stump.
could a prophet 2,500 years ago actually know that people who fly on modern jets would bind their clothing in luggage?
Here you have Bible prophecies all connecting the right dots in one context. Clearly, it goes beyond coincidence when you see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego cast into the fire after binding their clothes together like they were going on a trip with their luggage. Is Bible prophecy that accurate 2,500 years ago to make this perfect match on 9/11 with modern passengers bound inside their planes with their luggage, all being cast into the fiery furnace? We might as well name the three American jets Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Another interesting prophetic match for 9/11 is the king's assassins who threw Shadrach and the other two into the flames were themselves killed by the flames. They sacrificed their own lives to ensure the death of the other three. Sound familiar? Surely we remember the modern assassins, the terrorists, who sacrificed their lives in the jet fuel flames to ensure the death of the hostages and the death of the Eagle's economic power. What about the fourth man in the fire who showed up unexpectedly, who was like the Son of God? If 9/11 cannot show a fourth figure which somehow matches a description of Christ, then the rest of the clues are meaningless in a true prophecy. But there was a fourth plane which showed up unexpectedly also and sacrificed itself to save the lives of others. It was Flight 93. Yes, the fourth eagle came down to the earth from heaven and sacrificed itself like unto the Son of God. But just as we all remember from the news reports, the officials ran to Flight 93's crash site and found an empty hole. The reporter asked, "Where's the plane?" The fireman said, "I don't know, maybe you can help us find it." Flight 93 created an empty tomb.
When Flight 93 crashed, it left an empty hole. This is a perfect parallel to Christ in the empty tomb. The plane came down from heaven to earth to sacrifice itself for others. When the officials ran to the crash site, they found nothing but an empty tomb.
Remember, when they ran to Christ's tomb and found it empty? The parallels are beyond comprehension on 9/11. To show you how real Bible prophecies work, look at Abraham, who was about to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham and Isaac were an earlier type for the Father, allowing the sacrifice of his son Jesus. God fulfills true prophecies by like witnesses. You don't have a prophecy happen unless another type was modeled earlier in time, causing history to repeat itself in cycles. Prophecies are like chiasmus. You communicate something important, and then later on you repeat it again in reverse form. All of Daniel's prophecies are set up this way. One prophetic event is recorded in history as a prophetic foundation. Many years later, history will repeat itself with a perfect type of a second parallel and seal the prophecy by a second witness of a like cycle.
Biblical nature of prophecy. You may see a prophecy fulfilled that was in the Old Testament, that was fulfilled a few years later, and then decades later you may see the same prophecy fulfilled once again. And even hundreds of years later, you see it being fulfilled again on a grander scale. That seems to be the cyclical nature of prophecy. And this is what Paul has found, and this is what he is tying to as he is creating not only just a scriptural cycle, but also a political cycle that ties to these scriptures.
I'm Ross David, and I have no explanation as to why 9/11 is in the Bible. If this discovery is true, it will be the first time anyone ever successfully linked Bible prophecy to our day.
Thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
A modern Bush type, who represented the greatest eagle on earth, was President George Bush, who wielded authority over the great eagle wings in the last days. After he spoke on the stump at Ground Zero, his approval grew to 90%. That historical speech for a time united one nation under God. Bush's presidency and leadership became an eternal legacy, for the name Bush burned into America's history forever.
Why would God leave a clue like that in the Bible for no reason? That was not an accident made by Daniel. That clue was intentionally pointing to Iraq's transformation involving a future Bush. George Bush is freeing Iraq today. The Bible is real.
I'm very skeptical about things I hear, but I've never seen anything that makes more sense than this.
Even though Nebuchadnezzar and George Bush are mortals who make mistakes, they both are used for God's purposes. God takes a burning branch from a bush which came from a fallen tree on 9/11, takes it up on eagle's wings to Iraq, to transplant and graft new roots of freedom into a captive ancient land, to raise and transplant an eagle's heart into the old roots of Babylon. And the devil is enraged with this bush. In order to perfectly match Daniel's prophecies, Christ waited for the eagles to arrive at the Trade Center, matching the book of Exodus, where he brought his people by a burning bush upon eagle's wings unto himself. It is not hard to imagine that the people aboard the 9/11 airplanes were instantly disembodied as immortal spirits inside the exploding Trade Center. Is it not consistent to believe that there would be a prophetic type occur today, as one like the Son of God would again appear in the flames, just as occurred with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Is it possible that Christ himself was waiting there to take them home? For as disembodied spirits, the fire could no longer burn them, nor consume their immortal souls, as they beheld Christ in their midst on September 11th. It was that same power that brought America together because of this millennial event, paralleling the tree of life and the burning bush.
Behold, I am Jesus Christ, and I come quickly.
You know, I remember that September 11th was a very frightening time for America. I felt like we were losing control and struggling, and we all felt helpless, and yet angry, irritated inside that someone had done this to America. And you know, I felt so sad for the people that died, and so helpless, not knowing what to do. And yet this whole tragedy brought us together as one. And I think the spiritual value of this is that we all did become one for a while. And I think September 12th was really the telling miracle of what happened when America came together.
We hear people trashing this war, and here's convincing evidence that the war is God's will. You know, where are all the national ministers that should be behind this discovery? They got behind Y2K, so where are they now?
When you go through this evidence and confirm the connections, you come away with a lot of confirmation. The biblical evidence just keeps adding and adding until you see the pieces or the puzzle come together by God's design. The details match perfect history being mapped out long ago. There are no unmatching clues. If Saddam Hussein hadn't rebuilt Babylon, there would not have been a modern Babylon type to link all of these connections together with 9/11. Saddam became a modern link to the past and present prophecies, bringing America into prophecy.
We have located all of the clues given to us by Daniel, and they perfectly match 9/11 and the Iraq War. We have located dozens of fulfilled prophecies because every clue found opens up a second clue and a third and a fourth clue, and on until it completes itself within a perfect system in context. This has never happened previously. Date 9/11 was itself a prophetic witness of two ones coming together. The first plane was incredibly Flight 11. It had 2 pilots and 9 flight attendants, equaling 11 crew members. 92 passengers were on Flight 11. 9 plus 2 equals 11. The second plane hit the second tower at exactly 9:02. Again, 9 plus 2 equals 11. Countless people were dialing 9/11 on their cell phones. To casual observer, the 2 twin towers of the World Trade Center appeared as 2 number 1s, or a huge number 11. The horn on one tower creates a type of Daniel's 11th horn, paralleling the Roman Empire in the 6th century. You have a huge 11, almost 1/2 mile high, in flames in front of the whole world, witnessing this Bible prophecy.
My time is valuable. People can waste a lot of time reading books on Bible fiction. In the year 2000, a lot of top preachers were quoting the Bible to raise fears about Y2K. They made millions of dollars while we went out and bought their books, believing they were real prophecies in our time. Everyone wakes up on New Year's Day and nothing happened. Why do we still buy their books? False prophecies can cause Christians to stop believing in the Bible, and then when something true like this book comes along, people don't want to believe it. This book restored my faith in God and in the Bible in a huge way.
I can't believe this is in the Bible. That means Harry Reid has been lying to us the whole time?
Yep. Everybody really should read this.
Oh. So in other words, the eagle, which is America, is supposed to free Iraq. That's incredible. But it's sitting right here in the Bible.
Hello, my name is David Mortensen. I've been a teacher of the gospel. I have studied the scriptures for many years. What I'm seeing here and what you're seeing with Paul Gregerson's look at these scriptures here, we're seeing the political connection to the prophecies that are mentioned in the Old and New Testament. One of the things I've noticed in the many years that I've studied and taught the gospel is the cyclical nature of prophecy. You may see a prophecy fulfilled that was in the Old Testament, that was fulfilled a few years later, and then decades later you may see the same prophecy fulfilled once again. And even hundreds of years later you see it being fulfilled again on a grander scale. That seems to be the cyclical nature of prophecy. And this is what Paul has found, and this is what he is tying to as he is creating not only just a scriptural cycle, but also a political cycle that ties to these scriptures.
I'm Ross David, and I have no explanation as to why 9/11 is in the Bible. If this discovery is true, it will be the first time anyone ever successfully linked Bible prophecy to our day in a convincing way.
I have to say that my opinion is that any Christian in the world is gonna want this. This is something everyone's looking for. It's gonna fulfill so many prophecies in the scriptures that some prophecies people don't even know about. Like if you think about back on the Da Vinci Code, which was fantasy and fictional, it wasn't real, but it definitely caught people's attention to how things can still be put together in today's times. Well, I'd have to say this is something that's going to be huge. Just looking at it and listening to it, this is something that most people can't even comprehend. I mean, this is bringing the past back into the future.
Have you ever drove in circles for what seemed like hours looking for an address, or failed to have the correct address? Well, that's what Christians feel like, who sincerely want to understand the prophecies and instead get the same runaround by reading each new book claiming new prophetic insights. Myself, I'm so tired of Bible fiction books which sell false hopes that I would never write a book on prophecy unless I could connect all the dots for people who take the time to read my book. Anything less is spiritual deceit and willful deception for personal gain. I will hold myself accountable to my readers by delivering exactly what I promise. Every dot will be connected, and each assertion will have biblical foundation. I will actually show you in the Bible where Saddam Hussein did have direct connections to the terrorists who came into Iraq, and how an evil coalition would cause the towers to fall and bring great slaughter in the month of September on 9/11. I simply believe that much of the criticism coming from the mainstream media about Iraq and our president are false. They're like a big, huge, dead tree. There's no life, and it cannot bear fruit because the whole thing is nothing but a big lie. Once again, the media makes a problem this big into a monster this big in order to perpetuate the big lie. Most of the mainstream media are no longer relaying true information to us, folks. Most of its commentators are left and far left. You can no longer trust them any more than you can trust the tabloids for getting accurate information about your president or the Iraq war. You will learn that tornadoes and earthquakes and seas heaving beyond their bounds are signs of the second coming of Christ and not global warming. Christ said all these things must come to pass before he can come. He warned us to not let our hearts be troubled because of all these things which must come to pass. Global warming fears are therefore Satan seeking to make us afraid of the end times. Truly, man only thinks he is in control of this earth and forgets that he himself is in God's hands, and the earth itself will pass away. But God's words will not pass away, but all will be fulfilled. The 9/11 prophecies recorded by Daniel demonstrate that God knows the beginning to the end, and the past and the future are as one before the Lord. So what do you do exactly when you learn from the Bible that America will succeed in Iraq during the highest unpopularity of the war, when even major Republicans were distancing themselves from the war before the surge existed? A time when Bill O'Reilly was saying that Iraq had no chance of success because of that civil war. A time when the American people were losing faith in the war. So if I truly believe in Bible prophecy, I have to make some kind of a public record that will predate America's success in Iraq. I have to contact senators and media heads in my own area. I have to give them copies of my book and get myself into the newspapers predicting Iraq's success long before the surge. In 2006, I walk into KPVI Channel 6 and talk with investigative reporter Doug Anderson for almost an hour, telling Doug America will win in Iraq, giving Doug a copy of my book, showing the Bible scriptures which prove my point. I then go directly to the Idaho State Journal and talk with Chief Editor Ian Fennell concerning my book's declarations about Iraq's coming success during the worst possible time for Iraq succeeding. I give Ian a copy of my book and get myself into the newspaper itself, making a permanent public record predicting Iraq's success.
Paul was so moved by his biblical discovery about Iraq that he arranged a luncheon meeting with Senator Mel Richardson and his son Mark, where Paul explained his evidence about Iraq and 9/11 to the senator at a restaurant in Idaho Falls. Of course, senators cannot endorse any book dealings with religion, but can honestly acknowledge that a citizen in their state wrote a book predicting Iraq's success long before the surge began, without endorsement. Paul established an earlier public record during the Oklahoma bombing, where he warned the national media about a coming disaster just 2 days before the bomb went off. Paul became front-page news of one of the largest papers in the West, called the Salt Lake Tribune, because of his prior warnings before the Oklahoma bombing. Paul was invited to be a guest on a prominent talk show with Senator Dave Bresnahan, who is today a nationally recognized investigative reporter. The senator acknowledged on the air that Paul's predictions occurred before the bombing and were postmarked the day before the bomb went off.
Day before the bombing, and they received it shortly thereafter, and so that does give credibility to the fact that you were aware or could predict the potential for this kind of violence to take place.
Welcome back to Talk Back with David Bresnahan. We have on the line a guest this afternoon. His name is Paul Gregerson, and Paul is the author of the book Mark of the Beast. And Paul, we have been just going to our phone lines and taking some questions. We'll go back to the lines in just a moment. The phone numbers to call locally. In the paper, they implied that you predicted a violent event, but that you predicted a violent event would take place. Is that right?
I did, and I had told every organization in the country about it, every news organization, as far as the major networks about it.
According to the paper, the information you sent was postmarked the day before the bombing, and they received it shortly thereafter. And so that does give credibility to the fact that you were aware or could predict the potential for this kind of violence to take place.
Yes, and I actually predicted it March 25th. And
back to you, Courtney and Doug.
All right,
thanks, Kim. Another local man says he is not surprised by militia involvement in Wednesday's bombing. In fact, he says he predicted it a long time ago. Paul Gregerson's book, The Mark of the Beast, explains the fears of the militia and warns of radical events such as the bombing.
And a lot of these people are genuine patriots who believe that the United States is being taken over.
I don't know much yet. I'm going to have a press conference today and get all that out. Can you tell us about it, Dick? Well, I don't know what
is going to be happening in the world. You have a very impressive record as far as the Oklahoma City bombing goes.
Yes, I was front page of the Salt Lake Tribune after I published my book, my first book in 1993.
We're going to talk to somebody that I think we'll find very, very interesting. Paul, are you there?
I'm right here.
Oh, very good, and you're coming in loud and clear. This is Paul Gregerson. Paul was featured in a news article in the Salt Lake Tribune this past Sunday, and the article talked about the fact that he is the author of a book called The Mark of the Beast, which was published in 1993, and he's going to do some debunking He is going to tell us why the conspiracy theories that have been out there are wrong.
Certainly, many of you might remember the famous actor who played Herman Munster in the popular TV show The Munsters, starring Fred Gwynne. Fred had a national talk show several years before his death, and he heard about me and called me up at home. And I became a guest on his national show.
Chuck Carter at 12:05 each afternoon.
Back to the phones, we're talking to the author of a book on the Mark of the Beast. His name is Paul Gregerson. He's out in Pocatello, Idaho, and he's on the horn here this morning to explain how he came to solve the riddle of the beast. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here. We got Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and we've got Daniel the prophet's version of it, or his interpretation, and it comes down to a lot of sixes and the sign of the beast, and that turns out to be a man, right?
That's right. And it's not just the man in the king's dream. They call that an image.
David Brisnahan, we're familiar with his name. He's an investigative reporter.
Uh-huh.
And who else was on the line with you?
That was a caller. Her name was Phyllis or something. I can't remember.
Okay.
But, there was a lot of callers. I was, as far as Utah media. Peter Jennings even called me from New York. I talked with his office on the phone.
It's one thing to predict major events accurately. However, to publish them and create a public record before these events even happen cannot be falsified. Have you ever seen Pat Robertson or John Hagee or even the Pope ever accomplish such a feat in history?
Frequently today, we see the embarrassing results when media figures confront ministers who have made false prophecies that have not come to pass.
Yes, I are. But you convinced your followers that there would be a nuclear war in 2006 and 2007. As I recall, you brought it up to occur in 2000. It hasn't happened. What became of the prophecy? How were you so misled by Yahweh?
I really don't know how to describe the difficulty and frustration I felt trying to convince local and national media that I was sounding off like this because I wanted to either save lives or prevent bad things from continuing to happen. I was willing to make a fool out of myself and even be wrong publicly rather than just sit there and do nothing at all. Blatantly obvious to all is the counterproductive result of involving churches or church leaders into political campaigns. And we have seen the Reverend Wright and others turn this political campaign into a religious fiasco. But Daniel the prophet was an authorized prophet with the authority to speak politically about his time as well as ours. Because he is so far in the past, though, he speaks for God without involving any modern church into politics. He could write a prophecy favoring George Bush going to Iraq and remain independent from every church today. Any church leader today, however, would be branded with political motivations, where Daniel would not. Perhaps God foresaw a terrible problem today stemming from the Iraq War and 9/11 and commanded Daniel to send a message from the past. Perhaps we can understand his words today because we are now living through the prophecies that he wrote about. Do you believe Daniel was a true prophet of God who could speak into the future about us? I believe he did.
It is easy to claim things about theology without having to put your insights to such a public test. Either Paul discovered the actual meaning for Daniel's prophecies, or he made the luckiest predictions of our time.